Lecture 1.3 on Plato's Republic. This reading can be found in your Moser textbook on pages 42 to 45. The Republic is one of Plato's later works in which he works out and justifies an entire plan for human civilization. In this short section that we will read, we learn more about Plato's view of the world and of knowledge. This section is difficult and abstract, but it is valuable for increasing our knowledge and understanding of Plato's views. This section includes an important discussion of forms. So what is a form? A form is the eternal idea of anything. The forms are what makes every individual thing on earth possible. The forms are also the object of all true knowledge. It will be worthwhile to introduce an idea here that Plato will introduce in the Republic, the divided line. There are two main realms of existence, according to Plato. The real and eternal realm, where we existed before we were born to earth, is the realm of the forms. Everything there is the true exemplar of what it should be. Everything is the true idea of itself. It is completely non-physical. So there are two main realms according to Plato. One I'll call heaven, the realm of the perfect forms. And in this realm exist the perfect ideas or examples of everything. For example, that perfect triangle, which could never exist on earth, exists as an idea in heaven. At the same time, triangles on earth are always corrupt and imperfect. The idea of the horse exists, and every horse partially instantiates or represents or projects that idea, but the idea itself of the perfect horse exists only as an idea and is eternal even if horses go away. Finally, the idea of justice. As we saw in the last lecture, justice will never exist on earth, but we look for justice on earth, but our justice is always only partial and incomplete. Plato offers several arguments for his claim that the forms, the perfect representation of all things as an idea, must exist. These are usefully elaborated by Norman Melkert in his text, The Great Conversation. He calls them the geometric argument, the metaphysical argument, and the semantic argument. I will describe Plato's arguments using Melkert's convention. Argument 1, the geometric argument. What do we know when we learn a fact about, for example, the geometry of a square? Are we learning something about the physical drawing of a square? Let's say here on my paper. Well, we saw that can't be it because the square itself doesn't actually have the perfect shape and dimension necessary for a square, and it can't on earth. And we're learning a fact about the square as I have it in my mind, my individual mind. Well, that can't be it either, because there's no square that actually exists in my mind. I'm thinking of a square, but there's nothing square in my mind. You couldn't open up my mind and measure some square thing that was actually square. I'm just thinking about the square. For Plato, the square itself is independent of those things. So Plato's going to say, what I'm actually thinking of when I learn about a square and what the theory of the square, four equal sides, actually describes isn't something in my mind, and it's not something on earth. It's a fact about the very idea of a square, the eternal idea of a square that's independent of whether anyone had ever thought about it or not, and it's independent of whether or not any squares actually exist on Earth, which he believes they don't. The metaphysical argument for the forms is about sort of what kind of things there are, metaphysics. So what makes distinct objects be the type of thing that they are? For example, a face. Well, faces are what they are because they share the form of the face. Each one of these faces is importantly different, but they all fit into the category face because they share that basic form. Finally, the semantic argument for the forms, as discussed and summarized by Melkert. Semantic means an argument from meaning. So how do general terms, such as face or human, get their meaning? Not just what makes them what they are, but how can we use language in a way that's meaningful? So the word face and the word human both refer to something more than just a bunch of individual faces. The word face and human, when they're not used to describe a particular face or a particular human, are used to refer to the idea of a face. And the reason those terms have meaning, Plato would say, is because of the objective idea to which these words refer. So the central section on the Republic that you will be reading talks about that divided line. So you saw already this divided line, this is that image from the Melkert text as well, separates the intelligible world, the world of the forms, the world of ideas, where we existed with knowledge before we were born to Earth, from the visible world. What we can see, what we can feel, what many philosophers would say is the quote-unquote real world. This is the divided line. Now the divided line, as Plato starts to discuss it, is going to talk about how knowledge works, how thought works, and what the actual objects are that exist in these worlds. So let's start with something like the intelligible world. That's the world of the forms. Has levels of forms from lower to higher forms. You might say from less to more spiritual forms. So the form of the good for Plato is the very highest form. The form of the good represents perfection, complete unity, complete wholeness, and lacking in nothing. Something equivalent to how we might think of God. The form of the good is the highest form. And to a certain extent, the form of the good for Plato encompasses all other forms and makes them possible. Now there are also higher forms for Plato. Higher forms are forms that don't partake in any way of things that exist on Earth. So a higher form would be something like the form of justice, the form of beauty, where Plato doesn't mean here anything like physical beauty, the form of virtue. These forms exist as pure ideas, distinct from being mixed with anything in our world. And we know that Plato likes that spiritual essence unmixed with worldly things as much as possible. From that, we go to forms of science and mathematics. Think about something like the forms of geometry. Well, those aren't quite earthly forms, but geometry is meant to represent something like physical space. And for that reason, geometry is kind of mixed with ideas of almost physical things. Or think about a science like biology. If we're talking about the form of the horse, it's almost impossible to think about that form, even though the form itself is is not physical without thinking about something that it represents as a physical thing. So those are lower forms. Now, this is below the divided line. And here things are just things. Objects in our world. Things like our physical bodies, things like buildings, trees, and chairs. These are just objects. Don't have the same kind of purity that ideas have. And then shadows, images, and reflections are things that come from objects but have even less reality. Plato also assigns a form of thought to each of these. So reason and dialectic is the pure, true, absolute knowledge we can get of things like higher forms. We can have understanding of things like science and mathematics, and this is about the forms of science and math. But below that, all we can have is something like belief. Well, I believe this about things on earth, but things on earth are constantly changing. They're not the true forms of knowledge, because knowledge has to be, for Plato, a permanent thing. Below that, shadows, images, reflections would just be conjecture. Plato would probably add to this something like a play or a movie image. It's just an attempt to talk about or represent physical things themselves. The physical things themselves are just representations of the forms. And so by the time you're talking about representations of physical things, a photograph, a painting, it's not even the real thing, and the real thing isn't even that real for Plato, because true knowledge and true reality exists in these eternal forms, which could never be destroyed and which can truly be known with our minds. So you can see that as we move upwards on this divided line, we approach knowledge, and as we move down, the things above explain and make possible the things below. The form of the good, this universal, divine, godlike form of goodness, makes possible these higher forms like justice. Justice is a form of goodness. Beauty for Plato is a form of goodness. And those higher forms also make the lower forms possible. We can talk about something like the beauty of a horse, but it's only a representation of one kind of beauty. That form of the horse, for Plato, actually makes the horse itself possible. And of course, if there were no horses, we wouldn't have any paintings of horses.